Good evening, fellow believers in Jesus Christ. Tony is back on to read the next chapter of Hinds' Feet on High Places. Here it is. Chapter 6, Detour Through the Desert. After meeting Pride, much afraid, and her companions went on their way, but she was obliged to hobble painfully and could go but slowly. However, she accepted the assistance of her two guides with far greater willingness than before, and gradually the effects of the encounter wore off and she was able to make better progress. Then one day the path turned a corner, and to her amazement and consternation, she saw a great plain spread out beneath them. As far as the eye could see, there seemed to be nothing but desert and endless expanse of sand dunes, with not a tree in sight. The only objects breaking the monotony of the desert were strange, towering pyramids rising above the sand dunes, hoary with age and grimly desolate. To the horror of Much Afraid, her two guides prepared to take the steep path downward. She stopped dead and said to them, "We mustn't go down there. The shepherd has called me to the high places. We must find some path which goes up, but certainly not down there." But they made signs to her that she was to follow them down the steep pathway to the desert below. Much Afraid looked to left and right, but though it seemed incredible, there was no way possible by which they could continue to climb upward. The hill they were on ended abruptly at this precipice, and the rocky cliffs towered above them in every direction, straight walls with no possible foothold. "I can't go down there," panted Much Afraid, sick with shock and fear. "He can never mean that, never. He called me up to the high places, and this is an absolute contradiction of all that he promised." She then lifted up her voice and called desperately, "Shepherd, come to me. Oh, I need you. Come and help me." In a moment he was there, standing beside her. "Shepherd," she said despairingly, "I can't understand this. The guides you gave me say that we must go down there into that desert, turning right away from the high places altogether. You don't mean that, do you? You can't contradict yourself. Tell them we are not to go there, and show us another way. Make a way for us, shepherd, as you promised." He looked at her and answered very gently, "That is the path, Much Afraid, and you are to go down there." "Oh no," she cried, "you can't mean it. You said if I would trust you, you would bring me to the high places, and that path leads right away from them. It contradicts all that you promised." "No," said the shepherd, "it is not contradiction, only postponement for the best to become possible." Much Afraid felt as though he had stabbed her to the heart. "You mean," she said incred, incredu, incredulously, "you really mean that I am to follow that path down and down into that wilderness, and then over that desert, away from the mountains indefinitely? Why?" And there was a sob of anguish in her voice. "It may be months, even years before that path leads back to the mountains again. Oh, shepherd, do you mean it is indefinite postponement? He bowed his head silently and, much afraid, sank on her knees at his feet, almost overwhelmed. He was leading her away from her heart's desire altogether and gave no promise at all as to when he would bring her back. As she looked out over what seemed an endless desert, the only path she could see lead farther and farther away from the high places, and it was all desert. Then he answered very quietly, much afraid, do you love me enough? Do you love me enough to accept the postponement and the apparent contradiction of the promise, and to go down there with me into the desert? She was still crouching at his feet, sobbing as if her heart would break. But now she looked up through her tears, caught this hand caught his hand in hers, and said, trembling, I do love you. You know that I love you. Oh, forgive me because I can't help my tears. I will go down with you into the wilderness right away from the promise if you really wish it. Even if you cannot tell me why it has to be, I will go with you, for you know I do love you, and you have the right to choose for me anything that you please. It was the very early morning, and high above them, hanging in the sky over the silent expanse of desert, was a young crescent moon, and the morning stars shining like a bright jewel close beside it. There, much afraid, built her first altar on the mountains, a little pile of broken rocks, and then with the shepherd standing close beside her, she laid down on the altar her trembling, rebelling will. A little spurt of flame came from somewhere, and in an instant nothing but a heap of ashes was lying on the altar. That is to say, she thought at first there were only ashes, but the shepherd told her to look closer, and there among the ashes she saw a little stone of some kind, a dark colored, common looking pebble. Pick it up and take it with you, said the shepherd gently, as a memorial of this altar which you built, and all that it stands for. Much afraid, took the stone out of the ashes, scarcely looking at it and feeling that to her life's end she would never need a reminder of that altar. For how could she ever forget it, or the anguish of that first surrender? But she dropped the pebble into a little purse or bag which the shepherd gave her, and put it away carefully. Then they began the descent into the desert, and at the first step, much afraid, felt a thrill of the sweetest joy, and comfort surged through her, for she found that the shepherd himself was going down with them. She would not have sorrow and suffering as her only companions, but he was there too. As she started down the path, he began a song which Much Afraid had not heard before, and it sounded so sweet and comforting that her pain began to melt away. It was as though the song suggested to her a part, at least, of the reason for this strange postponement of all her hopes. This is the song he sang. The closed garden. A garden closed art thou, my love, where none thy fruits can taste. A spring shut up, a fountain sealed, an orchard run to waste. Awake, north wind, and come, thou south, blow on my garden fair, that all the splices may flow out as perfume on the air. Canticles 4:12 through 16. They reached the desert surprisingly quickly because, although the path was very steep indeed, Much Afraid was leaning on the shepherd and did not feel her weakness at all. By the evening of that same day, they were down on the pale sand dunes and walking toward some huts built in the shadow of one of the great pyramids where they were to rest that night. At sunset, when the sky burned fiery red over the western rim of the desert, the shepherd led Much Afraid away from the huts to the foot of the pyramid. Much afraid, he said, all of my servants on their way to the high places have had to make this detour through the desert. It is called the furnace of Egypt and in horror of great darkness. Genesis 15:12 through 17. Here they have learned many things which otherwise they would have known nothing about. Abraham was the first of my servants to come this way, and this pyramid was hoary with age when he first looked upon it. Then came Joseph with tears and anguish of heart and looked upon it too, and learned the lesson of the furnace of fire. Since that time, an endless succession of my people have come this way. They came to learn the secret of royalty, and now you are here. Much afraid, you two are in the line of succession. It is a great privilege, and if you also may learn the lesson of the furnace and of the great darkness, just as surely as did those before you. Those who come down to the furnace go on their way afterwards as royal men and women, princes and princesses of the royal line. Much Afraid looked up at the towering pyramid, now shadowy and black against the sunset sky, and desolate as it looked in the waste of desert, yet it seemed to her to be one of the most majestic objects she had ever seen. Then all of a sudden the desert was full of people, an endless procession of them. There was Abraham himself and Sarah his wife, those first lonely exiles in a strange land. There was Joseph, the betrayed and wounded brother, who had been sold into slavery, who, when he wept for his father's tent, saw only the alien pyramid. Then, one after another, she saw a great host, which no man could number, stretching across the desert in an endless line. The last one in the line held out a hand which she took, and there she was in the great chain herself. Words came to her ears also, and she heard them quite plainly. Fear not, Much Afraid, to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. Genesis 46 3. After this, they went back to the huts to rest that night. In the morning, the shepherd called, much afraid, again and led her away, but this time he opened a little door in the wall of the pyramid and took her inside. There was a passage which led to the center, and from there a spiral staircase went up to the floors above. But the shepherd opened another door leading out of the central chamber on the ground floor, and they entered a very large room which looked like a granary. There were great piles of grain everywhere except in the middle. There on the open space, men were threshing the different kinds of grain in many different ways, and then grinding them to powder, some coarse and some finer. At one side were women sitting on the ground with hollow smooth stones before them, grinding the very best of the wheat into the finest possible powder. Watching them for a while, much afraid, saw how the grains were first beaten and bruised until they crumbled to pieces, but still the grinding and beating process continued until at last the powder was fine enough to be used for baking the best wheat bread. See, said the shepherd gently, how various are the methods used for grinding the different varieties of grain according to their special use and purpose. Then he quoted, dill is not threshed with a threshing instrument, neither is a cartwheel turned about upon the cumin, but dill is beaten out with a staff, and the cumin with a rod. Bread corn is bruised, but no one crushes it forever. Neither is it broken with the wheel of a cart, nor bruised with horsemen driving over it. Isaiah 28:27-28. As much afraid watched the women pounding the bread corn with their heavy stones. She noticed how long the process took before the fine white powder was finished and ready for use. Then she heard the shepherd saying, I bring my people into Egypt that they too may be threshed and ground into the finest powder, and may become bread corn for the use of others. But remember, though bread corn is bruised, no one threshes it forever, only until the bruised and broken grain is ready for its highest use. This also cometh forth from the Lord of hosts, which is wonderful in counsel and excellent in working. Verse 29. After this, the shepherd took her back to the central chamber, and they ascended the spiral staircase, twisted up and up into the darkness above. There on the next floor, they came to another and smaller room, in the center of which stood a great wheel, flat like a table. Beside it stood a potter who wrought a work on the wheel. As he spun the wheel, he fashioned his clay into many beautiful shapes and objects. The material was cut and kneaded and shaped as he saw fit, but always the clay lay still upon the wheel, submitting to his every touch, perfectly unresisting. As they watched, the shepherd said, "In Egypt too I fashion my fairest and finest vessels and bring forth instruments for my work according as I see fit." Jeremiah 18. Then he smiled and added, "Cannot I do with you much afraid as this potter? Behold, as the clay is in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand." Jeremiah 18:6. Last of all, he took her up the stairway to the highest floor. There they found a room with a furnace in which gold was being smelted and refined of all its dross. Also in the furnace were rough pieces of stone and rock containing crystals. These were put in the great heat of the oven and left for a time. On being taken out, behold, they were glorious jewels, flashing as though they had received the fire into their very hearts. As much afraid, stood beside the shepherd, looking shrinkingly into the fire, he said, "The loveliest thing of all, O thou afflicted, tossed with tempest, and not comforted, behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colors, and lay thy foundations with sapphires, and I will make thy windows of agates, and thy gates of carbuncles, and all thy borders of pleasant stones." Isaiah 54:11. Then he added, "My rarest and choicest of jewels and my finest gold are those who have been refined in the furnace of Egypt." And he sang one verse of a little song: "I'll turn my hands upon thy heart and purge away thy dross. I will refine thee in my fire, remake thee at my cross." They stared at the huts in the desert for several days, and much afraid learned many things which she had never heard before. One thing, however, made a special impression upon her. In that in all that great desert there was not a single green thing growing, neither tree nor flower nor plant, save here and there a patch of straggly gray cacti. On the last morning she was walking near the tents and huts of the desert dwellers, when in a lonely corner behind a wall she came upon a little golden yellow flower growing all alone. An old pipe was connected with a water tank. In the pipe was one tiny hole through which came an occasional drop of water. Where the drops fell one by one, there grew the little golden flower, though, though where the seed had come from, much afraid could not imagine, for there were no birds anywhere and no other growing things. She stopped over the lonely, lovely little golden face lifted up so hopefully and so bravely to the feeble drip, and cried out softly, "What is your name, little flower? For I never saw one like you before, the tiny plant ant once, in a tone as golden itself. Behold me, my name is acceptance with joy. Much afraid thought of the things which she had seen in the pyramid, the threshing floor and the whirring wheel and the fiery furnace. Somehow the answer of the little golden flower which grew all alone in the waste of the desert stole into her heart and echoed there faintly but sweetly, filling her with comfort. She said to herself, he has brought me here when I did not want to come for his own purpose. I too will look up into his face and say, behold me, I am thy little handmaiden, acceptance with joy. Then she stooped down and picked up a pebble which was lying in the sand beside the flower and put it in the purse with the first altar stone. Okay, fellow believers, God bless all of you and have a good night's sleep in the grace of Jesus Christ. And may God continue that good work that He began in all believers since Christ was nailed to that cross. May it continue to be performed until He returns. Amen.